Good evening and welcome to the 2019 Ryerson Lecture. The Ryerson Lectures are named in honor of Nora and Edward Ryerson. Edward L. Ryerson Jr. was a long-standing member of our Board of Trustees from 1923 to 1971, so that is indeed long-standing, and he served as the chairman of the Board of Trustees from 1953 to 1956. The Ryerson family, now the Ranney family, has an association with the university that dates back to our earliest days when Martin A. Ryerson served as a member of our first Board of Trustees. In recognition of his philanthropy, the Ryerson Physical Laboratory was named in honor of his father. The annual Ryerson Lecture is an opportunity to hear from an esteemed member of the University of Chicago faculty and has been a central event in the intellectual life of the university since John Hope Franklin delivered the inaugural lecture in 1974. The collected Ryerson Lectures represent 45 years of the university's scholarly work across the disciplines and also provides a type of guide to much of the intellectual history of our broader society over that time. As many of you know, the selection of the Ryerson Lecture is a very special one for the university. Each year, a committee of faculty from around the university takes nominations and chooses one faculty member to deliver the following year's Ryerson Lecture. An individual whose extended research contributions are believed to be of lasting significance and who the committee believes the entire intellectual community of the university would like to hear from and will benefit from hearing. Last year, the committee selected Michael Silverstein to be the 2019 Ryerson Lecturer. Michael is the Charles F. Gray Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology, Linguistics and Psychology, and in the Committee on Interdisciplinary Studies in the Humanities. He's also the Director of the Center for the Study of Communication and Society. As an anthropologist and linguist, Michael seeks to interpret the social and cultural matrix of languages in order to understand why people from disparate parts of the world perceive the way they speak as a core part of their identity. His highly influential work is concerned with the structure, history, and functional contextualization of language, as well as the anthropology of language use and the history of linguistic and ethnographic studies. Michael also investigates language use and textuality in contemporary American society as sites of contestation and transformation of cultural value, reconceptualizing sociocultural and rhetorical practices in light of semiotic anthropology of communication. In 2014, he was honored by the American Anthropological Association with the Franz Boas Award for exemplary service to anthropology, the most prestigious award in the field of anthropology. The association described him in a way that will be familiar to all of us at the University of Chicago as a virtual force of nature in the discipline through his pedagogy and service, recognizing him for his efforts to reshape linguistic anthropology and bring it into a closer relationship to the rest of the discipline. He's also been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Michael first joined the University of Chicago faculty in 1972 as an associate professor in the Departments of Anthropology and Linguistics. He was previously a junior fellow in anthropology and linguistics at Harvard, where he also earned both his Bachelor of Arts and his PhD. And I will say he was also a graduate of Stuyvesant High School. Those of us who have known Michael for a long time recognize not only his great scholarship and his dedication to teaching, but also his role as a great citizen of the university. In all of these ways, he represents the highest aspirations of our intellectual community. And he has always done this not only with the great seriousness of purpose that reflected his work, but as we all recognize, with extraordinary great humor. Michael accepted our invitation to be the 2019 Ryerson Lecture in June last year. He prepared his lecture earlier this year, but due to illness, he is unable to join us this evening to deliver it personally. Instead, one of his closest colleagues, Constantine Nakassis, has been asked to present Michael's Ryerson Lecture tonight on his behalf. Constantine is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology in the college. He's a linguistic anthropologist whose research interests include semiotics, film theory and mass media, trademark law, brands and counterfeiting, and youth culture with a particular focus on India. Constantine was taught by Professor Asif Agha, I hope I'm getting that pronunciation at least approximately correct, who is professor of anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania and one of Michael's former graduate students here at the University of Chicago. Constantine is an example of Michael's tremendous legacy and influence and of the importance he has placed on building a core of scholars to preserve and continue to develop the fields that he has been so instrumental in shaping throughout his career. Now, Michael will be joining us from home and will be available to take questions after the lecture, and there's some technology that is set up to enable that to happen. So please join me in welcoming Constantine Nakassis, who will be delivering Michael's lecture entitled Getting Across the Message. Constantine?
Good evening, and thank you, President Zimmer, for your introduction, and to the Ranney family, and to Michael for making this event possible tonight. Were he able to deliver the lecture himself, Professor Silverstein would have done so with his typically erudite, contagious energy that many of us here have come to know so well and never fail to be inspired by. But in the circumstance, I am honored to lend him my boombox, as he called it, in asking me to be here tonight. And I'm flattered by Professor Silverstein's confidence in me to stand in on the occasion to get across his message. And here it is. We experience social life through the central medium of verbal messages. What coordination we achieve with others depends upon the fact that we talk to each other. We write and read in graphic forms. We manually sign as well as gesture in the visual channel. How do verbal messages really work? No matter what your English composition teacher might have told you, I think we have developed new light to shed on the matter. I want to use our time together to sketch the intellectual adventure I've been on along with students and colleagues for about 50 years now, an adventure I gratefully say stimulated that long ago by an invitation out of the blue for me to come to the University of Chicago to teach a graduate course on language and culture during an autumn quarter, 1970, visiting assistant professorship. Paradoxically enough, to shed light on the matter of how verbal messages do their sociocultural work, we need to think about pantomime. This silent performance art form, there's after all no language in it, consists entirely of movements of the body and its various parts in an otherwise seemingly empty space. From the flow or sequence of such movements, the mime's audience of spectators, the mime's addressees, come to see that the sequence of body and facial movement is tracing some culturally coherent event or recognizable experience in a determinate, if only imagined, frame of objects, populated physical spaces, and social situations that are almost, virtually is a good word, present. Two, because the addressees project them as they try to make organized sense of the movements. A successful mime immerses her or himself in a gradually thickening and dense context that the spectators need to project or supply as the counterpart, the complement with an E, of the body movements to make a whole interpretation. The body movements gradually come to perceived coherence in recognizable ways in a gradually determinate framing envelope, the necessary counterpart effect. The text, as we might call it, of bodily movement thus projects the surround of context. Context comes to reciprocally frame performer and addressee as in a compatibly same or similar social space of interpretation. As an event takes shape relative to the now no longer indeterminate context, the mime can even display affect or emotion, and even instill affect and emotion in the spectators. The mime and his or her addressees thus achieve a kind of social relationship. They both come to be intuitively understood kinds or types of personae or characters with human feelings and understandings through the magic of what we can term the dynamic text-context structure that comes into being in cognitive and affective space and is transformed over event time. The key words here are text and context. Keep in mind I've described a structure at the center of the mime's magic, text coming to linkage with context. The structure emerges over the interval of performed bodily narrative in a space gradually dimensionalized with volumes, planes, lines, and points within, as well as with projectively imagined people and things that reciprocally render the mime's narrative coherent for the audience. The audience, quote, gets the complex message that the mime endeavors to, quote, get across by projecting a densely structured context that no one actually sees, but everyone comes to understand must be there. I want to elaborate this account of the dynamic text-context structure in real time and space as we turn to discursive interaction, interaction that centers on the unfolding of discourse, of language in use. We will come to see that discourse, too, works in social life as a kind of multimodal pantomime, once we make the right analytic moves to study it, a central undertaking in linguistic anthropology over the last several decades. So what happens when two or more people, or even persons and non-human beings of some sort, participate in a discursive interaction? That is, recall, a social interaction centering on the deployment of language or its equivalent. In one of my disciplines, linguistics, we focus on the fact of grammar underlying one kind of regularity in discourse. Grammar is the universal condition of representational form anchoring every human communicative regime. No language lacks a grammar. In discourse, the grammar of language allows us to refer to entities and conditions in any cognizable universe, and we do so as we predicate modally true states of affairs about those entities and conditions. Linguistics centers on the forms called sentences and their parts, which give regular shape to how we go about our referring and predicating. Such grammatical shapes lurk in our utterances as templates for arrangements implicit in the uttered signals. I like to think of a grammatical analysis as like an in-depth X-ray of the actual referring and predicating discourse in discursive interaction. But does this really determine the message one gets when someone tries to get across a message? To jump ahead, the answer is no. By contrast, consider the interaction aspect of what we mean by discursive interaction, the focus of fields such as sociology or anthropology and social psychology. As social scientists, we're interested in the ways people are not mere psychobiological organisms. We're interested in persons with many identities defined by collective societal structures and their workings. As such, individuals are organized into cross-cutting groups. They instantiate or inhabit as well distinguishable categories of social existence in terms that they use to understand how they affect one another, in effect interpreting themselves and others in a reflexive or ethno-sociology. Interaction, then, is the cover term for all events of co-participatory coordination of the people and other beings of the social universe. Some interaction depends essentially on discourse. This is discursive interaction, whether face-to-face or remote. So using language allows us to represent and communicate about the world of our experience and imagination. And as well, using language is the social instrumentality for bringing groupness and social identities into being in the here and now, allowing us as persons to coordinate in such terms. We can't pretend that language lacks its representational function. But how can we productively think about how signals we use in this way may also play a role as the medium of social coordination, on the face of it, a very different function? In the course of communication, the processual discourse, the processual aspect of language, unfolds, as one says, in the, quote, social context, unquote, that it effectively brings into being. The context of discourse, as we can perhaps now see, is the always transformable structure of salient social identities and relationships that comes over interactional time to frame the ever-moving interactional here and now. Though projected, in fact, from the text of discourse, context at every moment is that framework in which individuals socially coordinate in one or more ways. We may start out not knowing much about an individual with whom we are interacting and vice versa, so we make a stab at uttering something. Our interactional partner contributes something back, sharpening the parameters of identity on which interaction proceeds. We make a further conversational move, perhaps even more revealing of who is involved in what, and what, therefore, must be going on socially. And in kind, our counterpart's next co-contribution about a represented world makes clear the dimensions of identity and the social consequences now possible if interaction is to proceed. Such alternating turn contributions constitute one of the elementary forms of measure or unitization of dyadic, two co-contributor, interaction. Such alternating contributions are termed adjacency pairs, where what one says in, say, even number position links up with what someone else has said in odd number positions, and where one says something in an odd number position, expecting the interlocutor to contribute an even numbered utterance to the event. It's like a dance, or better, practical poetry of turn-taking, a clear example of the principle of metricalization, of measure, which, when violated, constitutes trouble the participants have to address, as we'll see in a moment. Just think of all the different ways we greet each other in social encounters. Hi, how you doing? Uttered to our interlocutor contrasts markedly with, hello, how do you do? Note that the difference between these otherwise equivalently uttered greetings actually plays upon the grammatical forms out of which the interrogative phrases are composed, not upon any real difference of content words, how you do, but instead upon grammatical and phonetic style. Except for the grammatical variance in grammarians' terms progressive aspect versus punctual and stative versus active control, an otherwise identical question is being asked here. Each form of the question is, moreover, compatible with the special initial greeting word, hi or hello, as the case may be. Seeking a compatible response from the individual greeted, each variant will have set up, will have made salient and contextually real the social reality of possibly in play identities of self and other that can thus be presumed upon, that will have been, quote, gotten across, unquote, in whatever interaction may follow. The interlocutory partner gets the interactional import of the variant message by producing a compatible or non-controverting response, indicating that understanding of the social relationship come into being is mutual. Hi, how you doing? Offers friendly in-groupness. Hello, how do you do? Offers the distance of status-dependent positionality as salient in the situation, to which one had better pay attention. Which is accepted in each instance or contravened in the pas de deux of alternating co-participation? This is the question. As you can see, it's not so much what one says in the way of contributing to a representation of something. It's how one says what one says by way of such a contribution that does the work of social coordination. We can never successfully get across such a message that points to social context until someone else, quote, gets it, as revealed in a confirmatory or at least non-contravening return, one that is compatibly, as we say, in the same interactionally relevant denotational register. Imagine the uneasy situation if someone answers the proffered first register variant, the hi form, with the second, the hello form. Oops. It's like saying, keep your social distance, bub, and pay attention to who I am and who you are not. Only we don't have to say this explicitly. Just using the understood context-shaping variant as opposed to a register alternative does the trick. So, think of discourse using language and similar cultural signs as the very medium or intermediary of how people engage each other in social interaction. People compose and convey messages that they presume are, to varying degrees, appropriate to or allowable in the social context. People speak to the who, what, where, and why of the social situation as defined for them up to some point in an interaction. And given the purposiveness of communication, such messages are, to varying degrees, effective in clarifying and maintaining, in contesting, or in transforming the social context in determinate ways. That is, if social life mediated by discourse has any regularity or normativity to it, as empirically it seems to. Discourse is cumulative in time and space, to be evaluated not only in terms of semantic and logical coherence, the focus of the tradition of the Enlightenment in the West, but as well in terms of its degrees and kinds of coherence of social effect, both within and across interactional encounters. Logical coherence of what one says is measured as an aspect of what I like to call denotational textuality, representations of an experienced or imagined world that one co-constructs in the course of communication. By contrast, when we are interested in the coherence of discourse as action in the realm of social coordination, we can tell a narrative about interactional textuality, how discursive forms bring about one's understanding of what is happening in the cause and effect world of social coordination. An account of denotation tries to answer the question, what did they say? An account of interaction answers the question, in and by denotationally saying such and such using thus and such signs, what did they bring about in social life? How then is denotational textuality properly viewed, projected into interactional textuality? As in our example of greeting, how does how one says what one denotes come to count as what one contributes to the envelope of social life and lives in which communication is experienced? Of course, even the most carefully intended or strategized purpose of acts of an individual can go astray in all kinds of ways, because interacting individuals may not already be mutually coordinated as social types. The transcript on the screen reveals that as interaction proceeds between a certain A and B, even if it seems to cause a coordination problem, it can be, as it were, recalibrated through alternate, remediating coordination of identities, all through the magic of messages that are themselves about getting and getting across messages. Here's the scene of interaction. It's after hours in some organizational headquarters, for example, a suite of departmental offices in a college or university. Through a door left ajar, B walks into A's office in the evening, at the time when office cleaning regularly happens. A is staring at a computer screen in a corner of the office. A verbalizes without looking away from the computer screen. There's some more trash to take out under that table over there. B, surprised, incredulous facial expression, frozen body stance. A turning to take in B, oh, sorry, forgive me, I thought you were the janitor. Individual A reveals that the first turn at talk mistakenly ascribed an identity to B that lay behind the particular formulation, the how of the message used. In explanation, A describes that identity to which A's turn was directed. I thought you were the ... with a so-called noun of agency, a noun that denotes a status derived from someone's habitual or institutional role to perform. In this sector of the American English cultural community, A's meta-comment counts as a, quote, apology plus excuse, unquote, for A's prior turn at talk, that reflexively recognizes it as a social faux pas on A's part, and thus invites closure and discounting of the interactional segment of which it was intended as a turn. The unit segment of which it was a first contribution is termed an adjacency pair, you will recall. The reaction to which, contributed by B, was not talk, but was B's stopped in one's tracks bodily reaction. An apology plus excuse for A's prior misconstrual thus counts as an attempt to diffuse the situation of surprise or affront on B's part, and to allow a reset, partial or complete, of the relationship between A and B for any further interaction. What message is A apologizing for? A was simply trying to, quote, get across a message appropriate for an interactional context presumed to exist at that moment of utterance. A's original turn at talk was offered as a hint that counts as a request or order for B to do something. Why did A presume in issuing the hint as order that B would know in that projectively communicated identity what to do? Denotationally, A's first utterance appears to be just a statement of contextual fact. But of course, a statement of contextual fact that informed B of the existence of, quote, some more trash, unquote, that is to say, in addition to the usual or nearby available to cite trash, in a perhaps unexpected or non-visible location at some remove from where the speaker then was, quote, under that table over there, unquote. But note, not merely some more trash to, quote, take out, unquote, i.e. of A's office by someone, to be sure, the addressee, B. So A is specifying a focus of attention for B. The extra trash A's utterance is locating under landmark, a certain table, in relation to where speaker and addressee then were. And further, formulating a purposive action to be accomplished by someone in respect of it. Guess who? Did A utter something like, might you please take out the trash under that table in the corner of the office? Or even with a pointing gesture, take out the trash under that table over there? No. We're interested in the specific form A's message took, as opposed to these and other forms among several possible in the instance, so as to be able to account for how the form A uses actually points to the presumed upon social context, and so as therefore to understand B's second turn reaction. In American English, to any sociolinguistically competent user of the language, what A uttered did count interactionally as a command, a directive in the interactional text that put B in the position of having either to comply with its terms or not. A's misguided usage has, in fact, precisely conformed to the late Susan Irvin Tripp's classical empirical finding, summarized on the screen, that such hints as directives occur in the register of either talk among intimate familiars or to someone expected to conform to routine role expectations of a job or similar circumstance where identities and the presumption of associated role fulfillment are clear. How so? In an empirical study of American English usage in and around Berkeley, California in the 1970s, Irvin Tripp and her students studied alternative sentence types, each of which equivalently counted as the issuing of a so-called mand, a demand, an order, or request under particular relational social conditions that describe the context in which the mand was successfully communicated. There were 6 major types of utterance shapes among the 1,200 or so they collected, as summarized in the chart. They also discovered that in response to such a first utterance, each syntactic type normatively triggers particular verbal and other behavioral responses. That is, the addressee of the mand fulfills or declines to fulfill its terms. As it turned out, Irvin Tripp's syntactic variants for mands in social context parallel the dimensions of variation of using French vous and tu, German sie and du, and so forth that English speakers find so difficult to master. They involve a balance of how the issuer of the mand presumes that the addressee's contextual identity is entitled or not to the paying of deference thereto, and also the speaker's presumptions of informal, in-group intimacy between the speaker and addressee as members of a dyad. Think of a household with many routinized and allocated tasks where one can, quote, hint, unquote, to another household member that it is opportune for him or her to do a regularly assigned or generally expected task. We're out of eggs, said to the individual who normally does the grocery shopping. And note, of course, the generic verb here, which I've described a habitual routine activity, grocery shopping. Or similarly, the dishwasher is clean, said to the individually normally charged with putting away dishes and cutlery. So, in our office cleaning example, it's important for us to recognize that A is not simply reporting a state of affairs under an office table as an interactionally irrelevant denotational text, as B certainly recognized, taken aback in the framework of this particular interactional situation by what B took, with justification, to be a directive issued by A under the presumption of mistaken identity. A had been presuming upon the temporality of what goes on in the organizational site of an office building, including the habitual organizational functions like office cleaning. Knowing only that someone has entered A's office, A's first utterance appears to rest on presumptions of B's stipulated role within the organization's structure of statuses, thinking it must be the janitor. A's presumptuous utterance points to, it indexes, this understanding of the pre-discursive social context as the operative framework. Since A and B apparently share discursive interactional norms of the kind Irvin Tripp identified, B has interpreted what interactional text is a building in and by A's utterance, and accordingly, B performs surprise or even shock at A's misidentifying presumption in uttering the directive. B has not really responded to A's directive in kind, either silently doing the stipulated task, doing it with a verbal signal, no problem, sure thing, boss, or offering an excuse for non-compliance. B's bodily communication is in effect a commentary on A's ascriptive boo-boo, a metapragmatic or meta-discursive move, we term it, cutting the misguided would-be effect of the prior turn off at the pass, as it were. B has thus declined to participate in the interaction under the identity A has apparently ascribed to B. Don't you talk to me like that, young man, you may have heard from an offended parent at one time or another during your teen years, your parent issuing to you a verbal metapragmatic response. Similarly, A's following apology plus excuse is in effect a responsive commentary on that bodily commentary by B, which rejected the presumption of A's directive. A, as we can now see, justifies the use of the hint as directive utterance by revealing A's incorrect presumption of the role relational facts of the pre-discursive context that, by Irvin Tripp's norms, both A and B implicitly know as members of the culture. Both participants know the norms and how these norms are invoked in and by actual utterance in social context. And both A and B know that were B a slightly junior coworker, A might well have said, might I possibly impose on you to help me by taking out that trash under the table over there? All in conformity with the way the how of utterance, the specific syntactic formula, points to or indexes the dimensions of social context relative to which one from among a whole paradigm of variant forms is appropriate and effective. At least A apologizes to B with an excuse as well, a precursor to any repair or reset of the social relationship. A's apology is perhaps to be followed by an appropriately calibrated greeting ritual based on actual identities and mutually acceptable role relationality. This would put everyone on the proper footing in a post-workday collegial encounter framed as dropping in on a colleague's office after hours. A might then continue, "Good to see you, B. I was meaning to ask you about your new journal article, but didn't get a chance earlier." It's very important to see that even in this brief exchange, there's a social context presumed upon, pointed to, indexed by the particular forms of the utterances, and that the social context is transformed over the time of interaction as a function of each of these co-contributions to an emerging, doubly organized text, both the what has been said denotational text and the what has been done interactional text. Second, it is clear that discourse in this turn-bound manifestation is not structured merely like a run of beads serially strung along a chain, whether sentences or turn utterances or whatever. Rather, there's a complex chunking of layered segments organizing text, some more closely internally structured according to what the participants contribute to the unfolding metrical forms like adjacency pairs, and as well, there's also a hierarchical relationship of turn contributions that come to count as text and metatext, as shown on the screen. The meta-discourse, here the adjacency pair turns 2 and 3, commenting on the text of building under a particular interpretation, sometimes explicitly announced, of what was said, who said it to whom, and what it presumably counted as in the way of an interactional textual segment. For example, A's presumptuous and misdirected attempt at an order via an offhand formulation as a hint to the, quote, janitor. A's turn 1 is the first part of an incomplete adjacency pair. B's turn 2 acted out in pantomime, opening a meta-discursive sequence completed by A's turn 3. So the time-bound unfolding of units of discourse can, and here does, precipitate multiple orders of functional structure of textuality. So discourse as it unfolds over interactional intervals is measured out not necessarily in words and phrases that interest us as grammarians, but by all kinds of segment units drawn from a repertoire of alternative forms that point to specific conditions in the context in which they occur, sets of possible indexically potent alternatives, as we term them. In analyzing discourse, the significant units of formal indexical variance come into view through patterned repetition, parallelism, positional contrast, and so on. In short, a poetics of an emergent textuality in context. In interactional phases, a potentially highly elaborate structure of seeming hierarchical depth unfolds, even though at every significant identifiable phase of discourse, something about the form used makes salient the parameters of context that confirm and render clear what has been going on up to that point, and what will have been going on because of its occurrence. That is, how its contribution makes the context clear, and thus, reciprocally, how the context clarifies the text. Each significant segment unit presumes upon a particular configuration of social context. And insofar as this segment succeeds in its interactional contribution, confirms or transforms the context in which it now occurs. It really does seem to be an indexical, context-presuming, and context-entailing pantomime, the systematic character of which is generally beyond language users' consciousness or ken. Now, for those of you still with me, all this minute detail in an account of a 2-turn greeting routine or a 3-turn interactional misfire may seem highly irrelevant to important and serious matters. And if you're still with me, I would now claim that these examples, in fact, clearly demonstrate my paradoxical assertion that verbal discourse and social interaction works like languageless pantomime, insofar affording what we say an interactional sense by continuously projecting its context. Full sentence turn utterances like these examples are, in this respect, low-lying fruit. But what about the real subtleties of how we coordinate as interlocutors in running discourse, defining ourselves and projecting identities onto others, and so on? Here we find individuals periodically give off indexical signals that gradually accumulate over the duration of an encounter, allowing us to make cumulative sense of who, that is sociologically speaking, what they are, as presenting as identifiable persons in their contributions to an interactional event. In such everyday discursive interactions, what actually goes on into what I've been calling the how of what we say or signal to each other? What are the building blocks of interaction more generally, and how are they combined? My intellectual adventure at Chicago has led me to draw together strands of linguistic theory I was first exposed to in the classes and writings of one of my Harvard teachers, Roman Jakobson, through whom I was introduced to the semiotics of the polymath Charles Sanders Peirce, and as well to Jakobson's refashioning of Moscow and Prague formalist poetics for American domestic consumption. At Chicago, I was welcomed into a heady intellectual milieu of all my then senior sociocultural anthropologist colleagues eager to understand the symbols and meanings of culture, symbols and meanings most clearly at issue in the central foci of anthropological investigation, a society's rituals. In that milieu, it soon became clear to me that rituals constitute the ne plus ultra phenomenon of discursive interaction, that ritual forms unfold in space and time as complex, densely laminated metricalizations of signs, and that these signs make sense only in a context of beliefs or presumptions that they index, and that the unfolding textual form of ritual tropically instantiates that which it represents, a process I've come to term dynamic figuration. Surely, everyday discursive interaction, to the degree that it is effective, is a less vivid form of ritual, though interaction ritual it is, as my late friend Irving Goffman intuited. Or, put another way, ritual is the asymptotically full-tilt version of the semiotics of everyday discursive interaction, elaborated and intensified with all manner of incremental semiotic codes. And indeed, cracking the poetic code, as it were, of everyday discourse in the light of ritual has led me as well to many institutional sites, to courtrooms where ritual dialogues of, quote, truth and therefore, quote, justice abound, as well as to U.S. electoral politics, where an office seekers or office holders getting across a message that a polity's electorate gets as intended is the central medium of an increasingly market-structured imagination among media and political professionals. But back to the basics. What is so semiotically special about ritual? Performed and understood within its cultural order, a ritual is in effect an intendedly self-grounding activity event that compellingly structures the here and now of participatory human experience as instance made flesh on earth, the instance and dynamic figuration of the universal or abstract, what I like to term the cosmic order upon which ritual efficacy presumes. And Emile Durkheim, of course, certainly understood this. How does ritual accomplish this dynamic figuration? Here, on the left side of the slide, are the essentials. Full-blown, culturally recognized ritual, as we find it, typically involves specialized esoteric registers of language, cosmogonic narratives and structured beliefs, tropic denotation, multiple parallel metrical modalities, and dense and explicit metricalization. In short, it is a hyper-metasemiotic that intextualizes itself as an autonomous textual structure in cosmic context. By contrast, our everyday discourse in social context does not attend to these dimensions, yet there they are, ever present, in attenuated form. As an example of full-blown culturally recognized ritual, consider the Eucharist. A person officiating at the service of the Eucharist bounds off a ritual space of objects at a table, an altar in the space-time of liturgical rite, wine poured from a cruet into a chalice, wafers or pieces of bread on a paten or ceremonial plate, both comestibles at a ritual table between the officiant, him or herself, and a congregation of co-participatory onlookers. He or she begins to tell the story of the Last Supper of Jesus and the apostles, specifically quoting in the transposed here and now of first-person figural narration, and at the appropriate places for ostensive reference, pointing to the objects of the congregation's perception and the officiant's narration, gesturally holding up in turn the ritual objects. The congregants are informed that this is my body, and instructed, partake ye thereof. And likewise, this is my blood, drink ye of it, just as were the apostles, according to the liturgical order of the fateful Passover Seder that constitutes, by belief, actually the first or authorizing occasion of the ritual in which the officiant and congregants are participating in an unbroken indexical chain. The dynamic figuration of the ritual, thus, is such that the officiant is to the congregants in the here and now as Jesus was to the apostles at the sacred initiating moment. The first is spatio-temporally experienced as a continuation of the second, to which it is connected in the cosmic order of sacred belief. Observe, too, that the specific figurational equivalences, the ritual baptism of objects with names, will have been stated by someone whose authority goes back, indexically, as we say, in presumptively unbroken line to Jesus himself, via a causal chain of authorization. The ritual action to follow with these now figurating signs has thus also been given figurational value within the bounds of the ritual form. And ritually transubstantiated as these comestibles now have become, to eat and drink, to consume or incorporate, we should say, is mystically followed by an equal and opposite or greater incorporation. For as one consumes or incorporates the host in turn, first the officiant, him or herself, and then the totality of individual congregants, each figurationally re-sacrifices, quote, the Lamb of God in the, quote, new covenant, so as to be incorporated him or herself through the figure of mutual co-participation in the body and blood of Jesus made institutional on earth, to wit, the church and its spiritual corporation. The individual act of faith, incorporating so as to be incorporated, figurates in the Eucharistic mystery an aggregate becoming a collectivity in Christ, as one says, with a pregnant metaphor of containment made literal, such literalization being the case for metaphor in all ritual. The central ritual of Christian faith, moreover, is a brilliantly compact chiastic structure of action, as classical rhetoric would see it. From the Greek term for a marking with the letter chi, chiasmos, a crisscrossing reciprocation, figurating, of course, the cross. Here, the 90-degree perpendicularity of the iconic cross is dynamically figurated in the Eucharist by reciprocal action, a back and forth, whereby a small ingestion figurating incorporation is tantamount to, i.e. results in, a large counter-directional incorporation into a mystical corporate union or fellowship. This is literally an act, as in social act, of renewal of individual faith in the divine, selfless, self-sacrificing agency of Jesus, who became the sacrifice on the cross. This act, the foundation for the faithful of Christianity as lived. Here we come to the right side of our earlier slide. Our research over several decades has revealed that if you want to study the relationship between denotational text and interactional text, between what one says and what it's saying counts as doing in the organization of social life, then look to ritual for the clue. Even if you're interested in the most banal everyday social coordination. In particular, look to the form of ritual events and what they accomplish. Ritual does its work, as we've seen, through what my teacher Roman Jakobson terms its, quote, poetic function, unquote. Its hypertrophied, spatio-temporally bound metrical organization of potent tropes, as shown on the left, unfolding in phased sequence in the course of performance and participation. People are always nervous about getting the ritual order and the tropes precisely. Some rituals even have rehearsals to ensure faultless performance. And on this basis here is the claim about even everyday discursive interaction, giving analytic precision to Irving Goffman's observation that even in ordinary everyday life, interaction ritual, as he put it, is the basis for how individuals coordinate with one another as social beings. The poetic organization of what peoples everywhere experience as their ritual occasions has been clear to social anthropologists as well for some time. The poetic organization of everyday denotational text as projectable into interactional text makes good on the Goffmanian intuition once we learn how to parse the denotational language with the proper analytic tools. We may mislead ourselves into thinking that we affect social coordination through logical coherence of discourse parsed as sentences. But the claim here is that it is the poetic organization of linguistic form that is really, if unconsciously, at work. For example, to utter a statement denotationally agreeing with the prior speaker is a dynamic figuration of interactional alignment with the persona through which the prior speaker has articulated it, inhabiting, as it were, a position in a presumed upon schema of social differentiation that has been keyed into the current social event. The key is to see that everyday discourse is poetically chunked in terms of multiple, sometimes very subtle aspects of form, principally around categories of language called deictics and around variant context projecting register values of both words and expressions and construction types that seem to language users to fit together over spans of discourse. Lest all this leave you in a cloud of terminological confusion, let me emphasize the machinery involved. So we've parsed or analyzed what counts as denotational text in a very different way from what one might do if logical coherence were what counts in relation to interaction. Textuality, thus, is, as we've argued, a poetic function of language in use. In fact, one that operates completely differently from grammar. Where grammar involves relationships of ordinality, that is, things occurring before or after one another, as in first in a phrase, second in a phrase, third syllable from the end of the word, etc. Poesis, by contrast, is all about cardinality. That is, things occurring as equivalent units for repetition and elaboration. Nothing could be more obvious in this respect than ritual language, where metricalization, the occurrence of stretches of signs as measures of the overall text, reaches a maximum so as to include within the poetics of the text everything of importance to projecting an interactional text via dynamic figuration, attempting thereby to preclude any possible misfires. Our task within linguistic anthropology is thus somewhat different from that of the student of grammar and denotation, all the while recognizing that this world of academic and applied political communication exists. We are social scientists interested in exploring political communication by thinking about it as institutionally framed discursive interaction, the text precipitated in the conduct of which form the starting point for interpretive or hermeneutic analysis. What we study are events of communication that come to count as a particular kind of audially, visually, or other sensorially mediated interaction with social cause and effect that's consequential for polities and groups within such events. So how can we interpretively contextualize such discursive interaction in its, as Max Weber termed it, institutional matrix? Consider in this regard the institutional framework of American electoral politics and the concept of the consequential promise uttered by a candidate for office. There is, to be sure, a folk label, the campaign promise, that associates such utterances and the politicians who make them with the non-literal puffery of advertisement, the very lexeme campaign promise showing that it is not to be understood as what binds and commits someone to a certain course of action, as the non-modified term promise does. Yet, binding or no, it is a risky communicative act insofar as someone, especially partisans of an opposing candidate or any other similarly positioned critic, is likely to insist that though it may be a campaign promise, it is a fortiori a promise. Similarly, note how people argue about a, quote, deathbed conversion, unquote, or a, quote, shotgun marriage, unquote, emphasizing the contextual dependence of the socially consequential communication. And though a campaign promise may have been uttered or performed in the course of a more complex event, it is binding on its utterer. You may have heard of George H.W. Bush's now famous "no new taxes," long the Republican mantra at all levels of government, especially from the Reagan years. This phrase uttered at the formal beginning of Bush's 1988 presidential campaign. It was a staged imaginary quotation of the then-to-be-elected President Bush at that imagined time in the future where members of Congress would come to the White House pleading for more revenue. In 1988, Mr. Bush I was running scared of what the punditry termed, quote, the wimp factor, unquote, the fear that the voting public would recognize him for what he was, a Connecticut Yankee of a genteel, privileged Groton and Yale background, and not the he-man from the West Texas oil fields. So, he needed as a dynamic figuration some Clint Eastwood swagger, he of the spaghetti western and later Republican convention empty chair talk. So, Peggy Noonan, Bush's speechwriter for his nationally televised speech accepting the Republican nomination at the party convention in New Orleans on 18 August, she duly set up the scenario with the cinematic renvoi.
And I'm the one who will not raise taxes. My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. And my opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
Look at the extraordinary poetic structure of this rhetorical passage, which Michael has laid out to highlight. The parallelistic oppositions out of which this passage is built contrast two sets of actors on the political stage. First, Governor Dukakis, quote, my opponent, unquote, versus Vice President Bush, and who will or will not, if elected, quote, raise taxes, the key phrase. Second, the members of Congress versus future President Bush, who, Dirty Harry-like, will stand firm with his read my lips macho contempt. Note as well the description of Governor Dukakis as a politician, by implication different from the sitting vice president, and the ascription to him of three priorities or, quote, resorts in the way of holding the line on taxes, as Bush had already discussed. Note how beautifully these three increasing degrees of intensity are as well animated in respect of Congress, also then Democratic in majority, coming to the president not once, not twice, but 3 times. Goldilocks and the Three Bears, anyone? And each time they are thwarted in their attempt to raise taxes. Between these two segments is a kind of humorous parenthetical about how politicians, not the speaker, behave with a delicious play on words involving checking into a resort in the sense of a hotel for a luxurious getaway, and checking into whether or not some course of action is feasible. Well, Congress had only to come to Mr. Bush 1 once in 1990 with a revenue package that included tax increases. Note, not technically new taxes, and spending cuts for him to sign on to and sign the eventual legislation. So had he promised not to raise taxes? The Dirty Harry-esque line is about, quote, new taxes. But in the context of the poetics of the passage, raised taxes are, alas, as you can see in the red column, tantamount to new taxes. Notwithstanding the literal denotation that could let a proverbial Philadelphia lawyer slither out of culpability. Pat Buchanan and others hammered Bush on this in the Republican primaries leading up to the 1992 election, as did, of course, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, his successful Democratic opponent in the general election. As we can see from the example, while the passage may have drawn on popular culture to deal with the wimpiness of the candidate using as a focus a bit of conservative Republican orthodoxy, its risky poetics turned it into what the public, as well as media and political professionals, felt was equivalent to having uttered the explicit primary performative. I, George Herbert Walker Bush, hereby promise that as president I will not agree to or will veto any increase of taxation. And that is, of course, the supervening power of poetics and politics. There's a good alliterative phrase. A poetics that outweighs denotational efficacy, as in this case, somewhat ironically. We always want to ask then, under what conditions, under what social conditions, does whatever agentive source of such conveyed content get to communicate to the recipient target? How is communication shaped and infused with meaning in relation to norms of various sorts? Is an emergent text upholding or withholding expectations under like conditions of communication? What is the strategic role or function, or merely happenstance, like the inadvertently found art here that sunk Mr. Bush 1? What is the role or function or happenstance of such communication in relation to the interests that come together in political processes? In other words, we concentrate in opening up and framing discursive poetics so as to understand that communicative events, chains or cycles of such communicative events, societal structures that facilitate such chains or cycles, controlling interests that agentively establish and institutionalize such structures, whether positively or negatively. These are all part of the way that communication, which is to say poesis, is the central mediating fact of political process. It is what assertions of political, quote, power, unquote, is really all about. The demonstrated ability to shape and control conveyed message in all relevant media modes and channels. Recall the grisly poetics of videotaped ISIS beheadings uploaded to the web some years back, with their intertextual renvoi to Hollywood and similar images of medieval and evil Islam. Recall the images now a visual pictorial genre of random victim terrorism in public places. Recall the English language medium talking heads demands, straight out of the 1960s campus upheavals of Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation in Chiapas, broadcast to an international Anglophone world. All genred poetics, every last one of them. We must insist then that we try to go behind the mere surface appearance of political organizations of this or that sort, the ones that most people expounding political communication simply take for granted. The sociological and anthropological legacy we have is a relatively clear-eyed view on the distinction between societal structure, the presumed upon orderliness of the social universe, and social organizational process, morphology, if you will, and physiology. Communication in the sense of discursive interaction is the central mediator of process, as I've just said. Communicative events have a who, to whom, about whom, what, by what means, where in social space-time quality about them, of course. But we note that repeated, relatively alike or genred events of communication involving relatively similarly recruited kinds of people as the personnel of such events, this is the path of institutionalization of such events. And these processes of institutionalization are normativities involved in both senses of that term, the statistical or aggregate and the ethno-stipulative or prescriptive. It is on the basis of these kinds of empirical studies that certain general features of sociological study have emerged to theoretical discourse that is useful in particular for talking about political communication. So these are some of the fundamentals I hope we keep in mind as we think about communication, political and otherwise, and the essential and mediating role of poetics in it. In my own work, ranging from American political texts and discursive forms to those of the local scale societies on which I and others have worked, these questions that start from the poetics of discursive and textualization, the coming to textual formedness and context, have always been uppermost. And if I may be permitted a historical reflection on all this, I want to emphasize an important larger consideration in the way we look at language in the post-Enlightenment West. We generally think about the powerful lineage of Bacon, Hobbes, Boyle, Locke, and the founding of the Royal Society and its various continental imitators in the developing view of language as the central instrumentality of scientific thought. However, a central initial force in the emergence of modern Western views of language as an instrument of rationality and logical inference was the anti-Catholic bias of the Protestant Reformation, which especially focused on ritual and ceremonialism and all that it was made of. To be sure, good things like formal linguistics, analytic philosophy, and cognitive science can eventually emerge from bad beginnings. But the simplifying model of the structure of discourse, measured only by its logical, its syllogistical coherence, and the belief that this emerges sentence by sentence from grammatical structure. Such a model jettisons from our intellectual program considerations of how language is universally the semiotic medium par excellence for social coordination. This view of language certainly works to run computational machinery, but that's why there's such a problem with human-machine interfaces that take no account of discourse and other semiosis in their natural, that is, sociocultural habitats. To be sure, I confess that there's something deliciously ironic in my using the theories and methods of empirical semiotics, a rational scientific discourse about sociocultural meaning, to understand the systematicity of how communication actually works in far from rational or logical, if effective ways, in spite of ourselves, cultural creatures in the first instance. But perhaps this slight and I hope interest-whetting talk has revealed how the modern semiotic or hermeneutic social sciences of analyzing discourse go about their valuable work of figuring out how in the theater of social life we are such dynamically figurated stuff as messages make of us. Thank you. So we have a few minutes for questions, and Professor Silverstein will be joining us on screen any moment now. And I believe there's some mics in the audience for those who want to ask questions in the minutes we have remaining.
Thank you, Michael, very much. For that, for many of us, an inspiring talk, in that you laid out so clearly what it is that linguistic anthropology does in the broadest possible sense. I wonder if you would want to take us a little further into the kinds of methodological implications that your work has, especially since you've made comments about coming from a linguistics department and linguistic training to the anthropology department here, and in fact psychology as well. And I know that you've thought a great deal about the way that fieldwork works in various disciplines. So could you tell us something about the way that your understanding of poetics versus grammar works itself out in various kinds of field situations, especially since you've also worked in local societies, as you've said, in Australia and in Northwest Native America?
Yes, thank you for the question. I should first, of course, thank Bob Zimmer for the invitation to deliver this lecture, to the committee that made the recommendation to him. And most emphatically, thank Constantine Nakassis for his wonderful and energetic delivery of my text. to respond more directly to your question, my sense is that the distinction between the kinds of structures that we're centrally interested in as linguists or grammarians, let me call us, with no disparagement thereby, attend to normativities or regularities of a particular sort. And for the longest period of time, grammarians have been interested in such normativities and regularities. The point of linguistic anthropology, sociolinguistics, also as it's sometimes called, interactional social psychology and so forth, is, on the other hand, to look in terms of the dynamics of the socio-spatio-temporal, if I can coin a new abomination, socio-spatio-temporal dynamics of movement or flow, of coming to coherence, such coming to coherence being a text, as it were, in its context of existence. So it's really very much empirically based upon occurrences of one sort or another, as, for example, all of my illustrative material was this evening. So there's a real methodological implication here of studying what you might want to call discourse as it flows through and structures social life.
Hi, Michael. It's Eve Danziger from the University of Virginia. I came a long way for this.
Oh, hi.
Hi. It's a question about the Bush example, and given that you began with mime, the most famous part of that example is, of course, the sort of denial of language, right? Read my lips. I just wondered if you had any comment on that sort of ideological, metapragmatic, ostensive rejection, which has a poetics of suggesting that the promise is even stronger.
That's a nice point, Eve. The example, as it turns out, is highly complex insofar as I believe that the Clint Eastwood character actually says "make my day" rather than "read my lips." But in any case, the crucial point is that there is a position that character takes, and which is refigurated by the then candidate, which is, as you say, beyond language insofar as no amount of interaction in particular is going to budge that character from a particular position. And so it's very much a notion that that whatever kind of negotiation you the people coming for revenue, whatever position you take is not going to budge the position that I have already taken. In fact, in a certain sense, made a pledge about in that particular convention speech.
Hi, Michael. This is Anastasia Yanakidou from Linguistics.
How are you?
Good, good. It's wonderful to see you here. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the term poetics. As a scholar of Greek, I am a little bit confused with the word poetics because poetics, as we know from Aristotle's Poetics, and the Greek word poetics actually means relating to poetry. So I am a bit confused about the way this word is being used right now, and I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on what it means. So do we mean by poetics performative? Is it different from performative? In any case, I feel that there is an ambiguity in the word poetics that for many, also possibly in the audience, might send us back to the concept of a poem. And Aristotle in his Poetics studies poetics like as in poetry.
Yes, yes. The two points it seems to me are important here. One is that the modern, that is to say, 20th century and beyond, usage of the concept of poetics is rather different from Aristotle, and in fact, there was at one point a big argument about who was licensed to use it because of that. But I think if we look to the specifics of how poetic structures emerge in what we call intextualization, coming to textual formedness of discourse, that we're on safe ground with identifying poetics in the wider sense with this notion of coming to structuredness in particular ways. The particular ways, as I mentioned in the course of my talk, involve metricalization in the first instance, that is to say, the unitization of discursive forms into figures that depend upon repetition, parallelism, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, it's a technical matter, as it were, but the crucial point is that from the early 20th century on, poetics has been highly influenced by matters of textual form as the central problem of discourse. I know that many people find it problematic to say that discourse itself has a form, but there it is. Emergent most clearly, as I also said earlier, in ritual forms in particular. So I think it's important to let Aristotle go in the instance, just as it's important to understand that Machiavelli's prince is not necessarily a modern politician.
Okay, this brings the 2019 Ryerson Lecture to a close. I want to thank Michael for a wonderful and stimulating address, and I also want to thank Michael for everything he's done over so many years for so many of us here at the University of Chicago. So thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Michael. Okay.